Welcome, everybody. My name is David Wood, and it is my privilege to serve as chair of London Futurists. Our topic today is a relatively new movement within the futurist space. It is called Vitalism, and it was in May last year that it published its foundational white paper. It declares that its mission is to allow every human to live in optimal health indefinitely. It describes itself as a moral philosophy and community of action, forming a revolutionary movement to get humanity to fight as hard as possible to achieve unlimited lifespans in peak health. Of course, people have created movements in the past with somewhat similar goals, but as you'll hear and see, Vitalism has some unique ideas that are particularly timely here in the mid-2020s. To tell us more, to answer your questions, and to join in what I envision will be a wider conversation about the future, we are very fortunate to be joined today by one of the co-founders of Vitalism, Adam Gries. Adam will introduce himself properly in a moment, but for now, I'll just say that he is a 4-times company founder, an angel investor, a longevity advocate, and he has built products reaching over 80 million users. And he holds a B.Sc in Neuroscience. Adam, welcome to London Futurists. The floor is yours.
Hi, everybody. It's a privilege to attend today. And I was very excited to share a presentation which includes a few different lenses and some new ones that I am very eager to engage with you all on. So without further ado, I'll jump right in. So very briefly, who am I? Most of my adult life, I've been a tech entrepreneur. I've always believed that aging and death were bad. But for many years, I didn't think I could do anything about it. And I focused on building my career. That changed in 2020. I predicted early how COVID would happen and made a large return on the stock market, trading options, targeting the March lockdowns. And that experience led me to ask a lot of existential questions, like maybe many during COVID. It was clear to me that what really mattered was life itself, healthy life, but life in general. And it was also clear that nobody was coming to the rescue. That experience of COVID was really quite a jarring wake-up call. And so I fully reoriented to longevity. And I've spent the last 3 years building levers to get the most impact, trying to figure out what those levers should be. Today, we're going to define and understand the problem of aging and death, and the general problem of how we can achieve success, meaning those people who think that aging and death should be solved, how should we coordinate and what should our efforts and strategy be? What is vitalism in that context? A little more on longevity today, the way I see it, and what is vitalism's plan? So one way I always love to communicate to the mainstream is by saying that probably 99% of people can agree that it is a worthy goal to live in great health for as long as possible. And you see the asterisk there says postpone aging and death indefinitely, or end aging and death. The nice thing about this phrasing is that the only point of potential contention is what is possible. And I would say that we have a long history of evidence that things once thought impossible are later discovered to be possible. And so it's a very flimsy branch to lean on if you're trying to say that the only reason not to try to do something about aging and death is that it is quote unquote impossible. But I intentionally start with this statement because it's a statement that can be delivered to a mainstream audience, and that's really important. 80% of us are on track to die of aging. It's not a choice. The diseases that will kill us are not innocently age-related, like the common whitewashing euphemism suggests. They're a direct result of aging. Ironically, we already spend vast amounts of money on aging. but in ways that don't make sense. So we wait till people get these so-called diseases at the end of life. Some unlucky people get them a little earlier, but dominantly at the end of life. And then we throw huge amounts of money on them, only to extend life expectancy by a year or two, and often poor quality. And at the same time, we spend huge amounts of money on everything from Botox to supplements and other things that really just make a marginal difference or only act superficially. The thing is, to make progress, we need ideas and efforts. But we have very little of those because aging science is starved for funding, making progress super slow. Now, you'll see on this slide, we're looking at different lenses into resourcing, financing. On the left, you have a tiny amount of the NIH budget, the largest organization funding biomedical research in the world, even though a vast amount of their budget goes to the diseases of aging, which we would say is just paradoxical. In the middle, you see the biotech startup funding, 2017 to 2021. And you can see that aging commands only a very tiny fraction of this. And diseases of aging command a very large fraction. That's not noted here, but it's probably over 50%. And the same could be said about public pharma and biotech companies. So tiny funding, tiny resourcing, tiny efforts, and as a result of that, little progress. Just to give a context here, aging research and technology efforts receive 1/10 of the budget of the US national parks annually. That's how small it is. Some people think that these meager resources might be enough. There are all sorts of theories around how change might happen in this context, but none of them really hold much water. And it's not just funding. It does still take about 10 years or more to go from lab to clinic. It's very difficult to try anything in humans and often prohibitively expensive, which really slows down innovation and development. And our best and brightest aren't really working on this. There is in the culture no gravity to pull people and to celebrate people who work on this problem of aging. And so it's no surprise that today we still have no interventions for humans approved for aging, and we have not demonstrated any maximum lifespan extension. And that suggests that we need vast change, because at the current pace, we're not going to make it. Nobody on this call is going to make it past the current life expectancy or lifespan. So why is this happening? And this is looking at what is this problem? All of this conversation so far is trying to understand the topography of the problem. People are strangely bipolar about aging and death. They embrace but reject science, saying that aging is uniquely impossible to solve. Many people say they're fine with dying, but then they completely change their mind when given a terminal diagnosis. The objections are very strange and would never carry water in any other circumstance in terms of their logical basis. And of course, people say publicly one thing by expressing the idea that aging is okay and they're fine with dying, but of course they go to war privately to avoid these things. This is really well expressed in the billionaire paradox. The idea that billionaires are trying to live forever is very common media clickbait. But the reality is that 99% of billionaires haven't invested anything into the science to try to impact aging. They have the usual excuses that most people have, with some of them unique to billionaires. Sometimes there may be a very wealthy person who wants to start getting involved, and they might attract a certain type of perspective around aging, and then they're essentially that resource then may shield them from other ideas because they want to keep the money flowing in the direction of their pet project. That's a bit of a unique kind of case, but there are many, many other reasons for why billionaires don't put resources and attention towards this that are really very mundane. They're the same reasons that most people don't attend to this. Some of the excuses are really astonishing, like waiting for a good plan or fearing bad PR, or wouldn't people be bored to live longer? Now, it's not that it's impossible to change perceptions and behaviors. For example, if we educated kids from kindergarten, but it's extremely hard without structural change. And plus, a vicious cycle blocks change. Diseases are like the squeaky wheel that an entire system of sick care is built around. And even well-meaning groups like patient advocates contribute to it. The way it works is you have these disease lobbies and pharma influence that pushes lawmakers to define mandates that ensure almost all of our research money goes to focus on diseases. And other players, stakeholders like the FDA and pharma are comfortable with this since it's what they were built around and how they know to operate. Every actor in this play could be a positive actor. In other words, they're not malicious. They're just operating in the ways they know how, but the outcome ends up very negative for everybody. There is good news, which is that aging seems more solvable than ever. In the last 30 years, we've shown that aging is modifiable, extending lifespans in mammals, maximum lifespans, by over 30%, and demonstrating the information to produce youth is not lost with age. For example, one of my favorite examples here is that, when you clone animals, you can take the DNA of an aged cell, put it in an emptied egg, and repeatedly produce a DNA clone that has a normal lifespan. That's really unbelievable. And this is really quite new. Despite all this bad news, humanity can and has carried out great scientific projects that drove major breakthroughs and innovations in war and in peacetime. We should do that for aging. Everything from increasing the number of researchers to supporting public and private initiatives to updating regulations and more. This slide is just a panoply of ideas of what we could do if we tried hard and if we operated at the right level, if we were in the game. And if you look at history, there's a roadmap for major resource reallocations. With vitalism, as I'll explain in more depth, we're trying to follow this playbook based on the idea and the inspiration that we don't need to reinvent the wheel. We need a resource allocation revolution to try to fight hard against aging and for peak health. Movements of this type and resource reallocations do share a pattern. They start with a hardcore group, gain a beachhead, and they grow at key inflection points. Now, what is holding us back from achieving these changes? I can see 4 large factors, and there may be others, and I'd love the participation feedback as we discuss this collaboratively. One is fragmentation, another is death apologetics, then self-marginalization and poor communication, and finally, lack of a cohesive, plausible strategy to gain influence. And when I say us here, I mean all of the people who already believe that we should do something about aging and death. So let's jump into this a little bit. And this kind of tries to answer the question of, well, what is new about vitalism? Why do we even need something like that? The first point is fragmentation. And you'll see I wrote existing names can't unify us under it. But I'd like to first start by saying we have many organizations that do different things and are not very cohesive or unified today. Everything from organizations focused on just their particular vector of research or a particular style of advocacy or working with an entity like the government or some other entity, or being affiliated with a particular billionaire and not talking to anybody else. This is, of course, really unfortunate because it limits our ability to project influence collaboratively and leverage our common power. In that vein, we have a complete mishmash of naming, which causes the outcome that people don't actually know if they are talking about the same thing and collaborating towards the same goal. Some people use the word longevity to sell some supplement that has no evidence behind it. Some people use the words anti-aging to promote a clinic of this type or another. And some people use the word transhumanism to talk about things that are just outside scope for defeating aging and death in the context of biology. this is one major reason that we needed some new word. Another problem is death apologetics. You'll see something remarkable if you check on many of the organizations' websites who say that they are pursuing longevity and even that they are pursuing an end to aging. The word death does not appear anywhere on their website. It's absolutely remarkable. I invite anybody on this call to go to some of the organizations you've heard of or you've seen in the quote unquote longevity ecosystem, and you will find that the word death doesn't appear anywhere. Now, there's a rational reason for this. When people try to promote the ideas of ending aging and fighting hard against death in the last 20, 30 years, typically they were beaten down very strongly. There are all sorts of reasons for that, but the response, the way I understand it, among some, is the type of reaction of saying, oh, we don't want to end death. We just want to end aging. Can't we agree that aging is bad? Nobody wants to be decrepit. And that seems to be a more palatable proposition to different stakeholders who may be important in promoting certain ideas. But the problem is that when you cross the line into saying death is fine, you've swallowed a poison pill. Because assuming that aging is the problem, but death is okay, is not only ethically contradictory, but it pulls the ground from being able to argue effectively for massive resourcing. It makes it more of a political question about who's suffering how much. Because at the end of the day, if death is fine, then what is really the problem with aging? The only problem is suffering and decrepitude. But many other things cause suffering and decrepitude, making it really a political discussion which doesn't lead us to the goal that we want. The third issue is self-marginalization and poor communication. You'll see what I did here is I added 2 columns with words to use and not to use. I'm sure you've seen some of these words used in the longevity community. For example, a favorite word is radical. Some people love to use the word extreme or the word forever, live forever, immortality, infinity, etc., etc. Not only is there a problem with these words because they have connotations that may be negative or problematic to promote the message that we want to promote, but also they're often inaccurate. I mean, who here understands what forever means? I mean, the human brain arguably may not even be able to understand that. So using these words will produce the response, which then unfortunately has led people to death apologetics. Now, this is very important. We need a different type of communications, even if all we want to do is only get 3 to 4% of people in society to support this, which is what many may argue is the necessary amount for societal change. You don't necessarily have to convince 50%. The fourth and final piece here is lack of a cohesive and plausible strategy to gain influence. When you think about the scope that we want to reach, so 1% of global GDP to go to fight aging and death is the milestone that Vitalism Foundation describes as a good initial goal. We're talking about $1 trillion a year. And if we want to get to those kind of levels, which are contextual to the Apollo project or other similar projects, the existing strategies are just simply implausible. So for example, there's this one lens which says we'll get incremental milestones. And once we show, for example, a doubling of a mouse lifespan, or we approve some drug for off-label use for something, there will suddenly be a tsunami of interest. But the psychological resistance to confronting aging and death and structural factors make it very difficult to believe that such incremental milestones, while good, would drive this kind of change. And often, when pressed for timelines and a theory of change that includes KPIs and clear milestones, So in how many years, let's say we get this approved in dogs, how many years before we get the next thing and before we get something approved in humans, which will extend lifespan by how many years? And what exactly is going to be the mechanism to achieve that? The answers are typically hand wavy or rely on some sort of deus ex machina like artificial superintelligence. So having talked about the problem, both the problem of aging and death, but also the problem of how do people who think aging and death should be resolved act. Let's step to vitalism. Vitalism is a revolutionary movement for humanity to make unlimited lifespans and peak health its number one priority, its first priority. Revolutionary is important. It's not like a startup pitch. The idea is to actually change the systems and the priorities of society at the highest levels, meaning at the state level. Now, that doesn't have to be a country or a state necessarily. It could be a special economic zone. It could be all sorts of structures and could be economic in the private sector, but it needs to happen at the state level. Otherwise, we're not playing at the right scope. To do that, we established Vitalism Foundation, which is a nonprofit composed of committed vitalists who are making a growth engine, building out the community, and employing a strategy, which we'll discuss shortly, to try to expand the influence to accelerate the changes we're speaking about. And you can see on the Vitalism website, we're very clear. A great plan to save us from aging and death. One of the first things we realized we needed was a codification of values that defined what it meant to be vitalist. Now, anybody can be a vitalist. It could be somebody from the Don't Die community, or somebody self-identifying as a futurist or transhumanist, or just somebody who cherishes human life. It could really be anybody, whether or not they're familiar with the term today. The idea was to open a wide tent, but also set very clear standards of what it meant to promote this idea and to aim for the thing that we're talking about. Specifically, you can see it says in the first line, life and health are good, death is humanity's core problem, and aging its primary agent. Not death is a core problem, but death is humanity's core problem. It's very important. Now, the foundation itself is an organization to promote the mission. And anybody can be a participant in Vitalism Foundation and support vitalist values. Vitalism itself is, of course, a movement and a philosophy. It has no physical, let's call it, manifestation. And within the foundation, you can sign up. Anybody can sign up with an email. And if you want to be more involved, you can be mobilized. When we think about this idea of mobilizing, we're essentially breaking down the participants in this movement into two groups. Those people who want to take more action and the people who are not yet ready to take as much action. And this is because people who take action typically are willing to take more action. And we need to get that number to a certain critical mass to affect change. That is our belief. Now, not everybody can take action. It takes time sometimes, and the context may not be right, but mobilization is absolutely necessary. For now, you can become mobilized by making a small financial commitment. That's the way to enter on the vitalism.io website, which is the website for Vitalism Foundation. This also allows the foundation to be completely independent of interest and not reliant on the whims of any large source of funding. And you can even define your own cost. We're not trying to maximize revenue here. We want to get more people involved who can demonstrate they're willing to do something. But in the future, the idea is that you could become mobilized in many, many ways, not just through Vitalism Foundation, but through any vitalist organization. There could be organizations like, for example, Longevity Biotech Fellowship is a vitalist organization. I would say many others are, where one's participation, volunteerism, and other ways to contribute would be recognized, and thereby they would be included as mobilized vitalists. when somebody is mobilized, they can enter some working groups, private groups, etc., that are trying to accelerate our common mission. And they get things like free streaming of our annual conference, which is happening next week, and I'll speak to briefly later, and a lot of other benefits from companies who support our mission. So there are many companies, especially in the health space, who are led by vitalists or believe in vitalist values, and they support us by providing all sorts of benefits to mobilized vitalists and vitalists at large. I want to take a brief sidebar to speak about longevity today, and then I'll lead to Vitalism's plan, because just like with startups, timing is everything. So why is longevity suddenly in vogue? Is that even true that it's suddenly in vogue? Huberman, Peter Attia, Brian Johnson, lifespan becoming blockbusters. Is this just a coincidence? I mean, people have been spending on wellness and health forever, and even using the word longevity since the 70s. And if anybody hasn't read this book, Pro-Longevity, by Albert Rosenfeld, it's really quite remarkable because he repeats things that were then said 20, 30, 40, and now 50 years later. So there's been a lot of conversation around this, with some ideas staying the same. Well, because we haven't made as much progress, perhaps, on some of these vectors. Now, it's true that aging does have many countries on track to some sort of insolvency because of the decline of the working population compared to the retired population and poor planning on government's part. But I would say that there's something much bigger at play, which is a combination of secular trends that are forcing societies and humanity at large to reckon with aging, which is something that humanity really doesn't want to do. Life expectancy has been surging, and costs have been surging, as noted. More people are living in retirement for 20, 30 years or more. People don't want to die or age like their parents did, and there's a lot more visibility into that. Visibility also expresses itself in the data that we have. Wearables and other mechanisms, new diagnostics, give us so much data, which makes it much more evident than ever how we are declining. And the pressures of social media also cause people to gravitate to do anything to stay younger for longer. Private spending on healthcare is exploding as part of this trend. And it's also true that there has been promising science, although very little given the little investment. I describe the current state as a tale of two longevities. On the one hand, we have data personalization, preemptive care, and some biotech. And on the other hand, we have biotech science and what I would call paths to potential inflection. Today, the best interventions are still exercise and nutrition for health and longevity, really, whatever one means by that. Usually it would mean extended health span. There's nothing wrong with that. I mean, I want as much health span as I can get. But there's a big difference in types and scopes of data that we can get, and that is unlocking something different than what we had before. And we do have a few treatments that may have positive impacts on health and health span and maybe even lifespan, maybe a little bit. Now, this type of longevity, the first type, is often called like the Peter Attia type, squaring the curve, extending the period of relatively high function, and maybe, although I think the evidence is very, very limited there, and may not actually be sound, compressing end-of-life morbidity and costs. I'm not sure this is true. And I like to think about solutions in this space in the context of a health pyramid. So the first layer is knowing your data. There's a lot going on there. The second is making a plan. Some companies and efforts seem to be doing it, and then executing that plan. That's very difficult, right? Because the vicissitudes of life often get in the way. You can see some examples here in this list of different companies who are going after this first type of longevity, with a goal really of getting 5 to 10 years of extra good health span, being a very achievable goal. And there's a large ecosystem being built around it. And I think that's going to drive billions and billions of dollars in the coming years. It's hard to figure out the right product mix and willingness to pay. but these things are happening. Some of these pricier, more comprehensive services, they cover the whole pyramid, but many cover just the bottom. So, and even these services are often glorified batteries of tests that then add some support afterwards, but not very much. The ones that add real concierge support are just so expensive that most of the population can't afford them, like Peter Attia's clinic, Comité in New York, and others. And I personally went through a journey trying to create a health system to solve this problem for myself. I had a doctor, a nutritionist, physio, a trainer, all working in collaboration and trying to get to the edge of what we can do today. But there are limitations to try to square the curve, as probably most people on this call would agree. Substantial degradation still does happen, and it's drastic at later ages. Risk reduction of these so-called diseases of aging is limited, and the cost savings are really unclear from a public health perspective. Plus, of course, the probability of death skyrockets with aging, and no amount of sauna, lifting, or supplements or stuff like that is going to materially change that. The other longevity is the biotech science and inflection. So here, we're talking about that part, that 0.5% of the NIH budget, that 2 or 3% of the global biotech budget, et cetera. So what is that right now? Well, this is a chart borrowed from Nathan Cheng's State of Longevity presentation. It shows the current number of companies, the amount of funding, the valuation, and you can see there is quite some change, right? 180 longevity biotech startups versus 37 in 2015, 40 clinical trials, some of them getting to phase 3. But to keep it in perspective, Pfizer alone has 100 interventions in clinical trials at any given point. That's just one large pharma. And there is massive over-indexing on flavors of the day that are promising to possibly become blockbusters, like epigenetic reprogramming. And what happens, like we saw with Calico and previously with sirtuins, is you have a pattern of growing interest, large funding, and then declining interest and famines in longevity. So some people will look at the recent funding to epigenetic programming and the kind of space race that's developed, and they'll say, oh, this is really promising, but I would really take a huge grain of salt with that. This is just a list of some of the things that people are going after, often connected to the mental model of the hallmarks of aging, and also a few other things. But many strategies like replacement and others are actually woefully underfunded. There's an example of this space race for epigenetic reprogramming. You can see New Limit, Retro, Altos, these big companies that raised a ton of money from celebrity investors and billionaires. And then we have these other quite popular ideas like pet longevity recently that are getting attention and are promising. They're just not going to get us to the goal fast enough. So what's Vitalism's plan? Number 1, unify and grow supporters of Vitalist values. Anyone who agrees with Vitalism's values, with the declaration, is Vitalist. Then, sparking and amplifying a network of Vitalist and Vitalist organizations, because we need to somehow unify efforts and initiatives to project influence. And then, transform jurisdictions into longevity states. So, operate at the state level. Now, these 3 steps will happen to some degree in parallel. But we have to start by getting more people into the mix. The Vitalist Declaration is the opening point. So how do we spark and amplify a network of Vitalists and Vitalist organizations? If we take collaborative initiatives, we can create this virtuous cycle. And initiatives can be pop-up cities and events, local chapters, starting and joining companies led by Vitalists, creating inspirational media and content, funding that content, whether through Vitalism Foundation or other organizations that align with Vitalist values, and more. This slide shows a model to understand what needs to happen on the scientific side. It's the Longevity Acceleration Roadmap, which was published by Longevity Biotech Association. And you can see here that there are basically four important quadrants defining how we can approach the problem and how much it might cost. Now, the numbers here are really rough math. They could be quite a ways off, but they give an order of magnitude to try to understand this. In the context of some of the spend that we saw earlier on existing biotech, maybe 80% or maybe more is going to the bottom left quadrant, pharmacology. It will only buy us some time. Whereas advanced bioengineering, replacement, and biostasis are hardly getting any funding whatsoever. This is, of course, absurd. And part of Vitalism's plan, the foundation's plan, is to promote investment in the areas that need it most and that are the most promising. If you look at replacement, it's a pittance of estimated cost compared to advanced bioengineering, and yet it doesn't receive funding hardly at all. It's important that we have these roadmaps so that we can communicate to policymakers and other stakeholders to promote these ideas. So this is an example of an organization and initiative that exists within this Vitalist network that is imperative for us to make progress. And there are many other initiatives. The third part of Vitalism's plan is to transform jurisdictions into longevity states. So what is a longevity state? It's a jurisdiction that prioritizes fighting aging and death through research and technology and shows it by dedicating at least 1% of its GDP to that cause, whether through private or public resourcing. So we want to be agnostic. We don't want to take a position and say this must be done by the private market. Let the free hand of the market develop the innovations. We also don't want to say this needs to be some sort of centralized strategy. Different jurisdictions and communities will want to pursue this in different ways. Countries that are comfortable with government spending may be biased to increase R&D through universities and other channels. And there may be opportunities for reform of this kind of spending. As we all know, there are things that are problematic and inefficient with university grants and other systems. But that's one path. Another path is opening up regulations and letting the market do its thing. And this is expressed in places like special economic zone and other jurisdictions. And this is why, even though we use the word state, in fact, the idea is that a longevity state could be any type of jurisdiction. One example of a jurisdiction that really saw quite some transformation is the Free State Project. This was founded by Jason Sorens around 20 years ago, a little under that. And the idea was to choose a jurisdiction in the world. They actually didn't initially decide it would be the US, where libertarians could influence the policies to make it more of a free place based on their libertarian values. And eventually, about 5,000 people signed up to have a conversation, at the end of which they voted for a jurisdiction. And the jurisdiction that won was New Hampshire, a small state in the US, which, as you can see on the slide, has a relatively small population. And once the selection was made, people started moving to New Hampshire, and New Hampshireites started gravitating towards this movement, such that today, even though the movement is only comprised of maybe about 10,000 people, it has representation in New Hampshire House of 20 members out of 400. So it's punching something like 8x above its electoral weight. That's really quite remarkable. People don't talk about this very much, but the Free State Project has managed to push forward certain initiatives that are extremely important to libertarians, and they managed to do that through this transformation strategy. Another example of a state that is moving the longevity state direction is Montana. They had a state senator, they have a state senator there who about a year and a half ago took the initiative to start passing this landmark bill to expand the right to try. And this bill makes it possible for any doctor in Montana to prescribe any drug or device that passed phase 1 simply with a patient's informed consent. It's a landmark law because it means that anything that passed phase 1, which is earlier in the stream for approval, is now accessible. And as we all know, there are all sorts of cases where more data and more access by humans and data from humans would potentially dramatically increase the tempo of innovation. There are still challenges there, but the fact that this was passed is really quite monumental, and it required 2/3 of the House and the Senate, as well as the governor, to agree in Montana. Ken Bogner, the state senator who led the passage of this law, is now running for the House of Representatives at the federal level. And it's important to note that in the US, the House and the Senate have relatively small committees for Health and Human Services appropriations. They include 17 members in each of the houses, and these committees are extremely material in defining the NIH resource allocation budget mandates. So why does this matter? In the NIH, there is an institute, one of the major institutes of the NIH, called the National Institute of Aging, and it has a budget of around $3 billion a year. But $2 billion of that $3 billion is earmarked for Alzheimer's. We believe that a lot more of that should go into basic aging research. And by having representation which promotes this view, it's very plausible that we could change that mandate. So getting even one person who is oriented in this way into the House is actually very important. You know, everything in politics is about trade-offs. And if you have one person who really cares about this issue, it's very plausible they can move things forward. In the meanwhile, Dylan Livingston, the founder of A4LI, the Alliance for Longevity Initiatives, helped establish the first longevity caucus in the US, which includes 5 House members. So that's another very important step. This just happened quite recently. Another example of a state moving in the longevity state direction is Saudi Arabia, which committed up to $1 billion a year through Hevolution to aging biology. And they have grant definitions that really preclude a focus on pathologies and diseases of aging. So they understand what to focus on. They're really trying to do the right thing. And Hevolution has also supported the 101 million X Prize for Healthspan and is trying to do more and more. By the way, 1 billion a year is 1/8% of Saudi Arabia's national GDP. But worth noting is that when the Apollo project was carried out, a scholar called Roger Everett analyzed how much money was created in terms of value as a positive spillover of every dollar spent in the Apollo project. And he concluded that it was between $7 and $14 per dollar. So the Saudi Arabian government putting in 1/8% is actually really quite material, assuming there may be positive spillover effects. It may even get them to that 1% goal that we target as an initial goal. And finally, in Honduras, a special economic zone with progressive regulations has seen a growing biotech sector. Most recently, Brian Johnson of Blueprint fame has gone there for gene therapy for follistatin and sparked a flood of demand and revenue. And you can imagine that there could be regulatory arbitrage that would also increase the tempo of innovation. All these things are important, and we want to operate on the fronts that create the most progress in the shortest amount of time. To accelerate that, the conference that we're holding is called the Longevity State Conference, which is happening May 13th to 15th near Valencia, Spain, in a town called Cofrentes at a beautiful longevity resort. And at this conference, we'll be discussing how we can promote the emergence of longevity states, how we can unify people who care about vitalist values and make things change faster and better. So to conclude, what should you do right now? If you agree with these strategies, please sign up with your email at vitalism.io. And if you want to mobilize and take more action and support Vitalism Foundation, you can join as a subscriber at vitalism.io/membership. You can join us at the conference. If you find interest, we'd love to see you there. You can apply at longevitystate.com. We have a few spots remaining, but you'll need to hurry because they're running out. And of course, you can join or support any other Vitalist organizations, such as the Longevity Biotech Fellowship, A4LI, and others, which we are designating as we speak in this period. And finally, feel free to DM me if you'd like to get more involved in any way. And that's it for my presentation. Thank you very much.
Many thanks, Adam. Start up lots of conversation in the chat. There are quite a few questions already in the Q&A window. Let's start with a question about wording, vitalism. Natasha Vitamore points out that the word vitalism has been used in other times in history. It's associated sometimes with the notion of elan vital and so on. Did you have any particular reason to choose vitalism? Do you support earlier uses of the word?
Yeah, thank you. So, we were concerned about the choice of vitalism in the context that Natasha shares, and that's why we let the data guide us. So we asked, probably at this point, around 100 people in the field, scientists, founders, and more for feedback. And we were actually a little bit surprised that the vast majority, including many, many biology PhDs, didn't remember or never knew of this debunked vitalism. And that made us sufficiently confident that we could, quote unquote, overtake that meaning, including in the search rankings, et cetera. We've just gotten started, but I would say that probably in a year or 2 years from now, it'll be harder to even find that debunked vitalism online. Now, as to advantages, an ism is useful to define a philosophy movement, and it has the useful and easy to pronounce declination vitalist as a self-descriptive. It's also based on the root vita, from Latin meaning life, and it includes the word vital, which is useful to project the idea that our philosophy is all about being in robust health, not merely being alive. It's rather easy to spell, it's short, it works across many languages, and we received quite a lot of explicit positive feedback when compared with other names that we contemplated. So that's the reasoning for it, and thank you for the question.
Good answer. I'm generally going to take the questions that have got the most thumbs up. So if you're watching this and you see a question, you think, hey, that's good, let's deal with that more quickly, audience members, then hover your mouse over the thumbs up and we'll go there. So the one that is top of the list is by Daniel Craig. And Daniel asks about a potential ethical clash that might deter some people from getting fully behind the Vitalist project. He says, is there a risk that if people live longer indefinitely, it's going to impact the carrying capacity of the Earth? And what's your answer to that?
Yeah, great question. So it's funny because people often worry that solving aging would open a can of ethical worms, which I find to be really quite bizarre when you consider the current status quo. Today, the aged suffer inequity and disenfranchisement. We spend trillions foolishly on the last few years of life, and we get very little for it. Untold numbers of people have to part with their loved ones prematurely when we hardly try to stop the problem. And beyond that, youth and health are the greatest equalizers. When you're young, it doesn't really matter who has more money or more resources as much, but the elderly are most acutely impacted by these kind of things. Also, we're suffering depopulation right now in many prosperous economies, not overpopulation, it's actually the reverse. And aging, of course, causes a huge amount of suffering and death. One way to think about this is to flip the question. Let's say there were no aging. Would that be the way we would introduce a solution to the problem of a growing population? I think that would be a horrific idea. It would be like the last resort. We would think of any other solution. And so that is one lens. And the other lens that I would add to it is that, we don't need to solve every problem ahead of time. We can barely predict what's going to happen in 2 years or at the next election, let alone in 100 years or 200 years or 1,000 years when there might be overpopulation or other such problems. So, when the status quo is so bad, I think that not taking action because of some feared, contemplated potential event on the horizon, which is one of a huge number of potential events is unfortunately an unfortunate distraction.
Well, Daniel's following up here. He says he's not sure you've completely answered all aspects of his question. It's not an either or, but how can vitalism and environmentalism partner and be symbiotic rather than possibly trading off one against the other?
Well, I mean, my assertion would be that there's no inherent trade-off in the carrying capacity of the Earth for human life and defeating aging. And so until we see a stark trade-off, I think that we're pretty much, these two movements are actually inherently aligned because they cherish life. And so preserving life and preserving health are common objectives. And so I consider myself an environmentalist. I think that the goal of having great ecosystems that preserve nature is a worthy goal. And so I just don't really see a contradiction here. I know that there are pockets in the world where growing populations do create trade-offs with local environments, but those kind of problems are often political and have economic aspects and other aspects. And I don't think they directly conflict with this question of aging. They're much more local. That's how I would define it. I don't know if that answers it.
I think it does. I think there's also the fact that some of the science, which can help us live in peak health indefinitely, variants of that science can also help to improve the environment. It can have more effective ways of growing meat, for example, instead of having large parts of the earth dedicated to growing crops to be fed to animals that we will then slaughter and eat for meat. Things could be done with much less suffering, with less environmental impact by using some of the same synthetic biology mechanisms. So I see a mechanism there too. Now, I want to follow up there by looking at a question by Adrian Cull, who says, so how important are these objections really? I mean, people do raise objections such as, well, if there was longer life, there would be immortal dictators, we might have more inequality, and indeed the overpopulation. Do these questions really deter people, or are they, as you suggested, somehow rationalizations for not taking the question seriously? How much time should we take to answering these questions thoroughly?
Yeah, I think that we, just like any political campaign, we need to have an arsenal of answers at different levels in different scopes for every contention that challenges our perspectives. And sometimes there are legitimate trade-offs. So, would it be a potential negative for a dictator to live longer and impose their malicious ideas upon a population? Yeah, I think that would be horrible, right? On the other hand, if we look historically, did most dictators die of old age? No, they didn't. They usually died in an uprising or some other case, and we just don't know how the future is going to unfold. So in other words, I do think it's necessary to give solid answers to these questions. It's important to cast them in the context of, hey, maybe there is some risk, okay? Nothing is life in life, or very few things are 100% riskless, but is this really even within the galaxy of the scope of tolerating the negative aspects of aging, the suffering and death, that we should not really reorient our resourcing? And I'll give a small example there, which is this. Look, somebody might say, well, what are we talking about? Should we all just drop everything we're doing and just work to eradicate aging? Is that really what you're saying? And I'd say no. Like, you have a health budget, right? It's I don't know what it is in the UK and the US, it's $1 trillion from the government. Should we stop funding research into the diseases of aging? For example, leukemia or some other disease, or dementia, Alzheimer's? I don't think we should eradicate it completely. All we're saying is the ratio shouldn't be 99% to 1, a focus on pathologies versus on the root cause, which is aging. So we as a society constantly have difficult decisions and even trolley problems where we need to allocate resources and make certain sacrifices. I don't want to belittle that. It is very important. But where we are right now in the general scheme of things is just completely underweighted to where we should be.
I want to take a question from Richard Barker about this virtuous cycle that you drew, or rather a vicious cycle that you drew, involving the various vested interests in the biomedical world, the fund flow, the research appraisal systems, and big pharma that was interested in doing more of the same. In other words, having incrementally better drugs that give a little bit more treatment of some of the diseases of aging. So Richard's question is, how do we dismantle that set of vested interests? How do we create successful business models that are on the vitalist ideas rather than on this incremental ideas?
Yeah, so my answer to that is we create an interest block, and that interest block just needs to be more committed to its cause than the competing interest blocks. At the end of the day, if you think about it, generally politicians, whether or not they are, have good intentions or bad intentions, they want to get elected. They're at least in democratic countries, they have an incentive to get elected. And so if they look at options, right, and the options seem pretty much as good, they'll choose the one that gains them the more votes. So if we have a block that can produce that, votes, financial support, other benefits, right, that would motivate different stakeholders to support the things that we think are important, I think we will see progress. And what we're seeing today is that the amounts and the efforts required for change are just really, really small. It's often overestimated how much you need in terms of people and money to drive certain political change. There's just not, but I'll say concomitantly that many high net worth people, and I've spoken about this topic probably with as many as 500 to 1,000 over the last years, ultra high net worth. So let's say $10 million to $30 million and above. They often see putting money into politics as worse than setting it on fire. So getting any money, donating any money to campaigns or to lobbying, et cetera, is very difficult. But I think that we don't need to worry about getting like 50% of the population. All we need is maybe 1% of committed people in any given population to be effective. And New Hampshire is an interesting example of that. I think there are other jurisdictions where you could have a disproportionate impact, really sometimes a quite dramatic impact with small numbers.
Thanks. Now, in terms of building more support, there's a question by Dmitry Akatov, who says, can we get support from religious groups like Christianity?
So my short answer to that is to some degree. I mean, I don't think there's any contradiction between the idea of living longer in great health and religious groups. Although that being said, it's true that people who believe in an afterlife have in their own minds solved the death problem. So from their perspective, it's not that they're basically saying there is no death. I continue to live on. So what is the problem? How could it even be a problem? You're in denial of the fact that you're actually going to continue to live. And so I think there are some challenges around that. But at the same time, there are religious movements, like, for example, the Mormon Transhumanist Association and other groups within religions that do interpret their own religion in a way that allows for achieving indefinite, healthy lifespans in the physical world of today. And I would just say, if you look back at religions, right, look at Christianity, for example, of 1,500 years ago. Would anybody want to live today in the West according to the moral rules and expectations of that Christianity? I would say probably 99.999% no. So religions have been very malleable in terms of their interpretation and openness. And so, a lot of people are religious, and I think we should try to welcome them as much as we can.
Thanks. I'll take another question from Daniel Craig, who asks, what does good for you look like this time next year? For example, what do you imagine in terms of the financial basis, the community size, the political change in the world? What would be good and what would be disappointing?
Yeah, good question. So we've had something like nearing 600 people sign up on the website and agree with the Vitalist Declaration. We've done very little marketing or promotion of this. And so, it's looking like a nice hockey stick for now. But of course, we need to do a lot more. I think by next year, we should aim to get to at least tens of thousands of people who self-identify as Vitalist, maybe among other self-identifying lenses, and agree with the Vitalist Declaration. We have a goal of growing to 5,000 mobilized Vitalists. Now, as noted, mobilized could be defined in a few different ways, and we'd like to expand that. But essentially getting 5,000 people who have demonstrated that they're willing to do something, anything, whether it's pay a pound or volunteer for an hour or organize an event or do something else, or maybe even share something on social media. So those are two points. In terms of financials, we are contemplating launching an initiative of a longevity state, which has a token component. And we believe that that could help our community marshal resources quite effectively. VitaDAO is an example in the longevity space, which I think has brought in something like $10 to $20 million worth of capital that they are deploying in certain ways. So that's kind of a contextual effort that I think has seen some success. And it's hard to say, of course, we'd like to get as many resources as possible, but I think if we manage to somehow deploy 10 million to 20 million within a year, I would consider that successful. And I also think that we have to aim for at least that kind of impact, because otherwise we're just not moving fast enough.
So how would that token initiative differ from what VitaDAO are already doing quite successfully?
Yeah, so I need to be very careful in what I share for diverse reasons when it comes to this kind of stuff. But I will just say briefly that VitaDAO and other DAOs and other initiatives are not state-oriented. So in other words, you could imagine the DAO, and I'm a happy Vita holder. I strongly support VitaDAO. You can imagine the DAO choosing by the votes to deploy all of its treasury towards research. And that would never be within the mandate of a longevity state. A longevity state token would always be focusing on accelerating jurisdictions to become longevity states. And that need and the consolidation of a community which has a shared ethos around this idea of a potential manifest of citizenship or common, identity is something that is currently absent.
So let's talk more about longevity state. First of all, on wording, why is it longevity state rather than vitalism state or vitalist state?
Great question. Because vitalism and vitalist are not identifiable, understandable terms. And so exactly in the context of communication strategy, as noted before, I think it's imperative that we communicate in a way which somebody can quickly understand in a split second. And using the word vitalist at this time would handicap that.
Okay. So is the idea that many of the vitalism supporters would relocate to Honduras or Montana or wherever it is that this state is set up?
Well, any jurisdiction can transform into a longevity state, so it really could be anywhere. I think that for our community, the question will end up being, what are the jurisdictions that seem to be most accelerating and most promising? And that will create a natural gravity that will attract more and more vitalists, both in those jurisdictions, because, for example, look at a state like Montana. I mean, it's enormous. I don't know exactly how large, but it might be the size of France. Just going from one side to the other. Living in Montana, you probably will end up having a cluster that's living in a particular city. And what does it mean to live there? By the way, in the context of the Longevity State Conference, we're also talking about longevity cities and neighborhoods. So how do we as a community, because at the end of the day, you start facing this brass tacks. Hey, let's say you and I, David, want to move to Montana. Well, you're going to ask me, well, Adam, where are you going to live? Billings or Helena? I mean, because I don't want to live in Helena, and I want to live nearby you. So if you're not going to move there, I won't move. And there are all these foundational questions that have to do with establishing communities that are, I would say, going to be emergent from the community. So yes, there will likely be moving. And yes, there will also be consolidation within jurisdictions, and certain jurisdictions will be more open to the message. And I think many people just have never heard the message. So when they hear about it, they may gravitate towards it.
In terms of countries around the world, you said encouraging things about Saudi Arabia dedicating money to longevity and other related issues, but Didier Cornell commented in chat that they don't seem to have actually followed through with the amount of money that they said they were going to spend.
Yes.
Do you have any insight on that?
Well, I have a point of view, which is that stating that aging is a huge problem that merits that amount of GDP potentially, even if it's not fully deployed, is very valuable in and of itself. And so therefore, I think it's notable and deserving of celebration. With that being said, I do think there's a marketing aspect to it where it presents the top line value without the details, and a limited amount may have been spent so far. I'm not, in the accounting department of Evolution, so I don't know exactly. So I think doing more of it and deploying more, and also holding people to account and asking them explicitly how much has been spent and what are you going to do with it exactly is absolutely important. So, I would just say I take it with a grain of salt. Overall positive.
And the backing of the X Prize on HealthSpan is clearly an important thing. It's $101 million. I think that's one of the most significant things that happened last year. And it took a long time in gestation. It didn't come out overnight. And it did require funds to be made available so that the prize could be announced. So that is to be celebrated. And hopefully there'll be more such prizes and more such people involved. Talking about words, Danila Immortalis asks you about the word revolutionary. Is that word perhaps too radical? We might marginalize, self-marginalize. So I'm sure this has been discussed before.
It's a really great question. And, revolutions always inspire different connotations, right? The American Revolution, good. The French Revolution, not so good. The Communist Revolution, well, depends on the country you're in. Maybe very bad or maybe very good if you happen to be in China or in Cuba. I agree it is a controversial word or a potentially polarizing word, but we haven't come up with a better one. So suggestions welcome.
I had the word, one of your bad words is on one of the covers of my book, radical, where is it? So I think I'm sticking with radical because radical means more than incremental. It means getting to the root, and the root is aging rather than just the diseases. So I think there's scope for some discussion of words, but I think revolution can mean, doesn't have to be violent. We had a glorious revolution in the United Kingdom back in, what was it, 1688, 1689. And there can be other positive revolutions too. So I'll stick with that word for the time being.
Fair enough. I think it's fluid, and some of these definitions are fluid, and I'm certainly open to modifying my mental model as well.
And on the word death, Didier Cornell with the top most voted question just now, he says, Your own words were we should avoid negative words, but you used the word death. Maybe we should speak about involuntary death rather than just death.
Uh, yeah. I mean, I think that, look, I'm a growth guy. My whole career, I built apps, games, products, reached 80 million people. All I've been interested in for many years is just how to write the right copy, how to get people to do things online. And I'm sorry, involuntary death is just so clunky and so long that it's just like it's a non-starter for copy. If there's some better expression, I'd be open to it, but I don't think that's a sufficient alternative.
I think I'm with you there. And I see in the chat, revolution is getting more thumbs up. Garrett Smith points out the Industrial Revolution is widely held to be a good thing. Sure, there were some issues along the way, but my goodness, it has led to so much flourishing in the world as a result. Adrian says he's staying with the Live Forever Club as the name of his organization. He is the founder and runs that.
Yes.
And his point is he thinks we need to reach different audiences, and rejuvenation or longevity is sometimes a word that people don't understand, whereas live forever at least reaches some people.
I
So
agree.
he's arguing for a pluralism of vocabulary rather than.
I totally agree with that. Here's where we need to strike, in my opinion, an interesting balance. So today, uh, our community is tiny, marginalized, has limited levers of impact. And one of the tools that the mainstream uses to marginalize and limit the influence of other communities that challenge the status quo is to portray them as extreme, fundamentalists, and other pejoratives that make them more marginalized. So being aware that that is part of the arsenal of the status quo to diminish any challenges to it, I think is really should really guide us in trying to adopt the high road and adopt the mainstream as our own. In other words, we don't need to say we are something humanists. We are humanists. I mean, everybody should agree that death and aging are bad. This should be the status quo. We are the holders of the flame. When you know, it may be true that, for example, during let's say slavery, people said, well, we are radical. Maybe they used that word, and maybe that was okay at the time. At the same time, they also held an ethical standard that said, we are the holders of the universal moral that should be imposed. It's just wrong to enslave people. And that is the high road. That is humanism. That should be the core value. So with that in mind, because I feel like we as a community are currently, let's say, in a place where we've been marginalized, and let's say, or the ideas of ending aging and death are outside the status quo to some degree, to a large degree, it's really important for us to claim the mainstream. And so at the same time, I also agree that pluralism is important, and that some audiences will be much more motivated or galvanized by certain types of words. And so I guess where I land is we should have some sort of center of gravity in terms of our primary strategy, but we shouldn't be too prescriptive to say something is just absolutely wrong. And maybe in that sense, you know, instead of using the words use and not use, I should instead modify that slide to say use more and use less, or use carefully. And that might allow for certain groups to feel that they're more welcome. And I think that is very important. So I accept that as a potential improvement.
A question from Sam Ozovsky, who asks, what's the connection between Vitalism and the Longevity Foundation, or Longevity Biotech Foundation, I think it's called, from Mark Hamalainen?
Yeah. So LBF identifies as the Vitalist organization. So that's I guess, a relationship. Also, one of the co-founders of LBF is also one of the co-founders of Vitalism, Nathan Cheng. So he and I have worked together, but he is, of course, not the sole founder, and there are a variety of other stakeholders at LBF. So that's the relationship, basically.
But why are there two organizations rather than one?
Oh, well, Vitalism Foundation has a goal of accelerating the revolution towards longevity states and transformation to longevity states. Longevity Biotech Fellowship has the goal of onboarding people into actionable longevity biotech steps to promote technological breakthroughs. And the needs there, I would say, are different. So Longevity Biotech Fellowship could be seen, let's say, as a subset of the things that we may want to do to promote the longevity revolution. But that being said, is it a necessary constituent part of transforming jurisdictions into longevity states? It's certainly kind of associated or intersecting, but it's not clear to me that it would be more effective to be in the same organizational structure. And, you know, with centralization, there are also costs. There are efficiencies, but costs, right? Because you can't specialize in the same ways and serve audiences that are more diverse. So for what it's worth, that's my answer.
Thanks. We've got about 9 minutes or so left. I'll try and run through a few more of these questions since lots of good questions in the window. If you're thinking of asking a question and you haven't asked it yet, you'd better type it in quickly before we run out of time. Daniel H. says, why don't we be a little bit more selective in picking a country to work with? And his suggestion is Argentina. He says it's a jurisdiction that has more economic imperative. I'm not quite sure how that's determined, but do you have discussions about where it would be best to influence?
Yeah, great question. So one of the hot topics of discussion as we think about consolidating and kind of making decisions as a community, for example, with a token, is should we create any guardrails around which jurisdictions should be considered? And I'll just speak to that briefly at a high level. At a very high level, you could say, well, there's a freedom of movement issue. So if we choose, for example, the United States or the EU as a jurisdiction or a jurisdiction within it, like a state or a canton or a district, then we may be excluding the majority of humanity, which will not be allowed to enter those jurisdictions and cannot vote in them, et cetera, et cetera. The same could be said about other jurisdictions which may exclude people for other reasons. And so there could be linguistic barriers or financial barriers or other barriers. And so, you know, one of the things that we thought was maybe there should be, we as a community should have three meta jurisdictions, the Schengen zone, the US, and the rest of the world. And that might make sense because of freedom of movement in the Schengen zone, US, et cetera. And in the sense that in terms of resources, the EU and the US command vast amounts of resources. Maybe China could be in that same bucket. Maybe Japan should have its own bucket. I would just say that these discussions are very valuable. And we at Vitalism Foundation, we try to not be too prescriptive and leave it more to the community, because ultimately it's going to be feet in boots that decide to be somewhere or live somewhere, people in houses. And we can't define that for people. So we've just hesitated. Personally, I think that what's happening in Argentina is super exciting. I've heard that Milei is a vitalist, and I would love to spend time there myself.
I've heard it said that one of Milei's favorite books is this one, or rather the Spanish version of it. Jose
Yep.
Codera, the co-author of this book, has a photograph with himself and Javier Milei holding this book and smiling. So we should be reaching out to multiple kinds of people with relatively agnostic viewpoint. We're not going to mandate that we're only going to talk to people who have a blue political stripe or a red political stripe or orange political stripe, whatever. A couple of questions about things that haven't been talked about much. Didier says, Didier Cornell, he's surprised there's been little said in today's talk about AI and longevity. Isn't AI the way that's going to accelerate progress or maybe even kill us all? That's another
Yes.
threat if we're interested in avoiding death.
Yes, great question. So two answers. One is our current P-doom is 100% from aging. So any P-doom that's lesser than that, I think we should take in a heartbeat. With that being said, I don't think we should develop AI recklessly. And there are a lot of specific strategies that can be taken on that side. So that's just treating the kind of existential risk of AI, which I don't mean to diminish, but just to put in perspective versus the definite risk of aging. Regarding the contribution of AI to development of science and technology and the way it may change what it means to be human and consciousness. And I mean, there's things that Brian Johnson speaks about a lot. For example, this idea that we're undergoing a revolution where actually there's going to be some sort of merger with AI. I don't deny that this may happen. It's impossible to say really. But I would say that AI is a very promising tool. It may become a lot more than that. We don't know. Even with it being a promising tool, we can't lean on it as a crutch. So in other words, even AI itself needs data. So you could argue, well, you know, the AI isn't just going to deus ex machina us out of our problem. It will need us to take agency and collect the data and build better algorithms and think about the kind of biological processes and other processes that need to be simulated, et cetera. And so I think it's really important and we should invest in it. Absolutely.
The other thing that one reviewer, Vriet, said maybe we should be talking more about is the importance of good diet and good health choices. One reason, arguably, why longevity statistics aren't going up much is maybe more people have got bad diet and bad health. So what does vitalism have to say about that?
Yeah, great question. So, you know, we're very intentional about saying in peak health as our goal. And that means that jurisdictions, in our perspective, should be aiming for peak health. Now, some will do it through libertarian policies, some will do it through more centralized policies, and that's fine. But philosophically, I don't think that vitalists would say it's okay for, you know, 40% of the population to be obese, because that's causing what we would probably agree is some sort of self-harm or harm to those people. Now, how to solve the problem is a different question, of course. But I would say that part of this conversation, and this will be discussed quite a lot at the Longevity State Conference, is when we think about communities, states, neighborhoods, policies, how can we promote health and well-being optimally in the here and now? And there are amazing, I think, opportunities to improve that. And so, yeah, I mean, I could give some examples of ideas, but there are many ideas.
Well, that leads me to what I think will be my last question, because you talked about what will happen at the Longevity State Conference. Could you say a bit more about what your expectations are? And if there are people listening to this who are wondering whether they should apply to attend, what are the considerations they should think about?
For sure. So I would separate it into a few parts. Number one, it brings together some of the most motivated, creative, independent, and smart thinkers on this topic from around the world. It's really, you know, just looking at our attendee list, it's a privilege to have all these people in attendance. So that is one primary reason to attend. And the idea, of course, is, well, why would you want to be around such people? To inspire yourself, to learn, to galvanize new ideas, and to hopefully spark initiatives. And that's a big KPI for us. So that leads me to the next point, which is like, how would we estimate whether the conference was a success? You know, coming from the tech world and building products with growth, I always think in the sense that, like, if it's not measurable, well, then it's meaningless, right? So what are these measurables that we would evaluate? One is network density. So one thing we measure when we do events is how many people did you know when you arrived at the event, and how many people did you meet at the event who you intend to stay in touch with. So we want to maximize that number. Number two, what are things that you learned that are materially influential to the way you are going to do things? And if you can answer that there were at least a few things or one thing that you learned that's materially influential, I would say that's quite meaningful. And then third, there is the concept of initiative. So we're going to have talks 50% of the time, but 50% is workshops. Workshops from imagining policies for longevity states, strategies for different organizations and unification, companies that can make a lot of money and leverage that to promote the ideas we share, and growth strategies to reach more people and communicate in the right way depending on the audience. So all of these kind of conversations may produce new initiatives. And I would say, I would love to see at the end of the conference, at least maybe 2 to 4 initiatives that end up creating material value for, let's say, at least 1,000 people each for each of the initiatives that are novel.
Well, that's plenty of reasons to want to go there. And I'm glad I've already got my application in. I've got my ticket. I still need to figure out exactly how I'm going to travel there to Conferentes in Valencia in Spain from the Startup Summit, which is in Berlin at the end of the previous week. I'll be on the road, meeting different people who have different ideas on longevity, vitalism, anti-aging, these different things. I'll be trying to figure out what are the good connections to be made, trying to figure out what are the mistakes to avoid, because sometimes we in this community do shoot ourselves in the foot, but more positively, what are the ways in which we can look forward to 12 months' time, things being very different, much better than today. So I want to thank you, Adam, for giving your time to this discussion. I'll say to the audience, we are going to shut down the formal part of this meeting in a moment or two. But if you want to hang around and chat a bit, then in about 8 minutes' time, at 20 to the top of the hour, I will open things up again. And those of you who haven't had a chance to speak, those of you who have just been wandering in the background, you'll have a chance to take the microphone and chat for a little bit longer, but without the camera, without the recording going. So if you're shy of appearing in the YouTube, don't worry, you won't be there. So thanks very much, Adam, and I encourage everybody to look at vitalism.io and follow the fascinating links there. If you've got suggestions or questions, then you can certainly join the community and get involved. Final words, Adam?
I just want to say it's a privilege to be presenting and sharing with this community, and I thank you for all your questions. And I'll just add that I'll also be in Berlin for the Healthy Rejuvenation Summit on the 9th to the 11th. And on the Longevity Week website, there's going to be a small event for Vitalists that anybody here is, of course, welcome to join.
Thanks very much.